It is 7 a.m., December 25th, 1985. The silence of the semi-detached house is shattered not by the sound of church bells, but by a noise that defines a generation, the piercing, rhythmic screech of a cassette tape loading data. Bleep, bloop, screech. In the glowing light of the living room, surrounded by a drift of discarded metallic wrapping paper, gold, silver, and electric blue, a child sits cross-legged on the swirling pattern of a beige carpet. Their eyes are fixed on the portable television set in the corner, where flashing colored bars are slowly building the loading screen of Manic Miner. The air smells of ozone from the overheating power pack, mingling with the slow-roasting scent of a turkey that went into the oven 3 hours ago. Resting on the sofa, forgotten for the first time in 6 months, lies the Laminated Book of Dreams, the dog-eared Argos Catalogue. Its pages are wrinkled from months of intense study, the toys section circled in biro. But the paper dream is over. The plastic reality has arrived. The 1980s Christmas has landed in your living room with a thud of batteries and the promise of a digital future, bringing with it a neon-soaked energy that is about to change the British family forever. To understand the seismic shift of the 1980s Christmas, you have to remember what came before. The 1970s had been a decade of brown and orange, of woodchip wallpaper and making do. It was a time of strikes, 3-day weeks, and a lingering post-war sensibility that said you should be grateful for an orange in your stocking and a game of Ludo. The 1980s took that sensibility, spray-painted it neon pink, and threw it out of the window. This was the decade where aspiration became the national religion. Under Margaret Thatcher, the cultural narrative shifted from collective survival to individual success. The right-to-buy scheme turned council tenants into homeowners. The deregulation of the banks flooded the economy with credit. Suddenly, having stuff, new, shiny, branded stuff, wasn't just a luxury. It was a moral imperative. Christmas became the ultimate expression of this new philosophy. It was no longer about the homemade paper chain or the knitted jumper from Grandma. It was about the brand. The aesthetic of the British home changed overnight. The cozy, cluttered warmth of the 70s was replaced by the high-tech look. We wanted black ash furniture. We wanted chrome. We wanted gadgets that looked like they belonged on the flight deck of a spaceship. And this desire for the modern trickled down to the Christmas tree. Gone were the delicate glass baubles of the past, replaced by shatterproof plastic or satin-covered spheres. The fairy lights stopped being simple colored bulbs and started flashing in aggressive, epileptic sequences. We draped the tree in lametta, thin strands of metallic foil that looked like liquid gold or silver, turning the fir tree into a disco prop. But this explosion of consumerism didn't happen in a vacuum. The 1980s was a decade of stark, often brutal duality. While the yippies in the City of London were popping champagne and wielding brick-sized mobile phones, celebrating Lode Samoni, the industrial North was fighting for its life. The Christmas of 1984 stands as the defining moment of this divide. For half the country, it was the year of the video recorder and the microwave. For the other half, specifically the mining communities, it was the strike Christmas. Families were surviving on food parcels and the solidarity of soup kitchens. There were no BMX bikes or home computers in those stockings. There were donated toys and the fierce, burning pride of a community under siege. Yet, strangely, this inequality didn't dampen the national obsession with the perfect Christmas. It intensified it. For the working-class parent, the pressure to provide a magical Christmas became a badge of honor. You might be on the dole, you might be striking, but you would starve yourself for 3 months to make sure your kid got that Masters of the Universe Castle Grayskull. This was the era where the must-have toy was weaponized. In previous decades, a toy was a toy, a doll was a doll. But in the 80s, marketing became a precision science. Cartoons weren't just entertainment, they were 22-minute commercials. He-Man, Transformers, My Little Pony. These weren't just objects, they were ecosystems. You couldn't just buy the figure, you needed the vehicle, the base, and the villain. The pester power of the 80s child was a new and terrifying force. We were the first generation to be targeted directly by advertisers on Saturday morning television. We didn't want a bike, we wanted a rally burner. We didn't want trainers, we wanted Nike Airs. This shift transformed the living room floor on Christmas morning. It was no longer a scene of wooden blocks and board games. It was a sea of plastic, hard, brightly colored, injection-molded plastic. The smell of a new toy in the 1980s was distinct, a chemical, factory-fresh scent that hit you the moment you tore open the blister pack. It was the smell of the future, and we inhaled it greedily. The 1980s Christmas was louder, brighter, and more expensive than anything Britain had seen before. It was a time when we stopped looking back to the traditions of the Victorians and started looking forward to the promises of Silicon Valley. But to get those gadgets, to secure those plastic treasures, you had to navigate a physical landscape that was the beating heart of 80s commerce. The high street. Before the internet flattened the world into a screen, the British high street was a physical pilgrimage. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, the town centres of the UK were not just places of commerce, they were battlegrounds. To experience an 80s Christmas shopping trip was to engage in a contact sport. The pedestrian zones were rammed. The pavement was a sea of puffer jackets and wet umbrellas. Loudspeakers mounted. On lampposts blared Slade and Wizard at distorted volumes. The air smelled of roasting chestnuts from street vendors and the exhaust fumes of the gridlocked traffic. At the center of this universe stood the undisputed king of the British High Street, Woolworths. Woolies was not just a shop, it was a cultural institution. It was the sensory hub of Christmas. You walked in through those heavy glass doors and were hit by a wall of heat and the smell of pick and mix. The layout was chaotic and glorious. The entertainment counter at the back was the Holy of Holies, where teenage boys stared longingly at the 7-inch singles chart on the wall. The toy aisles were piled high with Star Wars figures and Care Bears. But Woolworths was most famous for its role as the emergency Christmas supplier. It was where you bought the wrapping paper that tore if you looked at it too hard. It was where you bought the selection box, that netting stocking filled with Mars bars and Milky Ways that was a mandatory gift for every child. And, famously, it was the primary vendor of the Christmas record. In the 1980s, the Christmas #1 was a matter of national importance. It wasn't just a chart position. It was news. People bet on it. The battle between Wham and Band-Aid in 1984 wasn't just music. It was a cultural event. And you bought those singles at Woolies, handing over your pocket money for a piece of 7-inch vinyl in a paper sleeve. But Woolworths had a rival in the affection of the British shopper, a place that operated on a completely different, almost futuristic model. Argos. Argos was unique. It was a shop with no shelves. You walked in, and instead of browsing goods, you browsed a book. You found what you wanted, wrote the number on a tiny blue slip of paper with a tiny blue pen, and took it to the till. This was the Laminated Book of Dreams. The Argos Catalogue was the Bible of the 80s Christmas. It arrived in late autumn, and for millions of children, it was the primary source of entertainment for 3 months. We didn't just look at it. We curated it. We circled items. We dog-eared pages. We wrote wish lists that included the catalog number, the page number, and the price, handing them to our parents like professionally drafted invoices. The Elizabeth Duke jewelry section at the back was a source of fascination, filled with gold clowns and sovereign rings. The electronics section was pure sci-fi, showcasing hi-fi stacks with double cassette decks and graphic equalizers. But the real drama happened at the Argos collection counter. You stood there, clutching your receipt, watching the conveyor belt come out from the mysterious warehouse behind the wall. You prayed. You prayed that the box sliding down the rollers was yours. Because in the 1980s, stock control was analog. If the Optimus Prime was sold out, you didn't know until the person at the till typed it into their computer and said the most heartbreaking sentence in the English language. "It's out of stock at this branch, love. You could try the one in Basildon." This reliance on physical stock and physical cash meant that paying for Christmas was a year-long endeavor. Credit cards were arriving, more on that later. But for the working class, the 80s was the era of the Christmas club. You would pay a few pounds a week into a scheme at the local butcher, the catalogue company, or even the pub. It was a forced savings plan. In December, the hamper would arrive. These hampers were legendary. They contained tinned ham, tinned pudding, tinned peaches, basically an entire Christmas dinner that could survive a nuclear winter. It wasn't gourmet, but it was paid for. This physicality defined the era. You carried the bags. You fought the crowds. You stood in the rain waiting for the bus home, your fingers turning white as the plastic carrier bag handles cut off your circulation. There was no add to basket. There was only the hunt. And when you finally got those presents home and hid them on top of the wardrobe, you felt like you had genuinely won a victory. If you grew up in the 1980s, there is one book that defined your childhood more than The Hobbit or The Lion, The Witch and the Wardrobe. It was the autumn-winter edition of the Argos Catalogue. It is impossible to overstate the cultural gravity of this object. It was the Laminated Book of Dreams. It sat on the coffee table like a shimmering monolith of possibility. The ritual began in October. You would take the catalogue, which was heavy enough to stun a burglar, and retreat to a quiet corner. The paper had a distinct smell, a unique mix of cheap ink and gloss finish. You would turn to the back, past the lawnmowers and the kettles, until you reached the promised land, the toy section. This wasn't just browsing, it was strategic planning. We didn't just look at the pictures, we audited them. We circled the items we wanted with a biro, often prioritizing them with a star system. A Star Wars Atati Walker got 3 stars. A Cindy House got 2. We dog-eared the pages so aggressively the book doubled in thickness. But the catalogue offered more than just toys. It was a window into the bizarre aspirations of the 1980s adult. We would stare fascinated at the Elizabeth Duke jewelry section, marveling at the sovereign rings, the gold clowns with ruby eyes, and the namespace necklaces. We looked at the personal care section, filled with tease modes and foot spas, gadgets that promised a life of automated luxury that never quite materialized. The Argos Catalogue was the pre-internet search engine. It was how we learned what existed in the world. If it wasn't in the catalogue, it didn't exist. But while the catalogue was the paper dream, the reality of the 1980s Christmas morning was increasingly digital. This was the decade of the tech invasion. For the first time in history, the television set ceased to be a passive object that just broadcast the Queen's speech. It became a monitor. The 1980s saw the arrival of the home computer, and it sparked a domestic revolution and a fair few arguments in living rooms across Britain. The tribe you belonged to mattered. You were either a Sinclair family or a Commodore family. If you were Team Sinclair, you unwrapped the ZX Spectrum 48K. It was a tiny black plastic slab with rubber keys that felt like dead flesh. To make it work, you had to plug it into a cassette player. This is the part that modern children simply cannot comprehend. Games didn't come on cartridges or discs. They came on audio cassette tapes. To play Manic Miner or Jet Set Willy, you had to put the tape in, press play, and type load on the keyboard. Then you waited. For 20 minutes, the television would scream at you. Scree, bloop, cur, tr. Flashing bars of cyan, magenta, and yellow would strobe across the screen, inducing a mild epilepsy risk in the dog. You couldn't breathe. You couldn't turn a light switch on in the hallway in case the electrical surge crashed the load. It was a delicate, fragile magic, and 50% of the time, after 20 minutes of screeching, the screen would flash, "R tape loading error, 01." The devastation was absolute. You had to rewind the tape and start again, but when it did work, it was miraculous. We sat cross-legged on the floor, mesmerized by pixelated blobs moving across a screen, controlling the action with a joystick that usually broke by Boxing Day, specifically the Kempston joystick interface, notorious for its fragility. If you were a Commodore 64 family, you had it slightly better graphics, better sound, but the loading wait was just as long. This technology changed the geography of the room. The TV was no longer for the family. It was for the computer. Dad would often take over, claiming he was setting it up for you, only to be found 3 hours later at 2 a.m., red-eyed, trying to beat a high score on Chucky Egg. This was the dawn of the screen time battle, though we didn't call it that yet. It was the first time that a Christmas present actively separated us from the rest of the room, pulling us into a glowing 8-bit trance that signaled the beginning of the end for the monopoly of the board game. If the living room was a battlefield of technology, the dining room was a theater of aspiration. The 1980s was the decade where the British working and middle classes decided that meat and two-veg was no longer enough. We wanted to be continental. We wanted sophistication. And in 1985, sophistication tasted almost entirely of mayonnaise and ketchup mixed together. The 1980s Christmas dinner began, almost by law, with the Prawn Cocktail. For a decade, this dish held a tyrannical grip on the British starter menu. It was served in a glass chalice, usually one that had been collected with petrol tokens from a Shell garage. It consisted of a bed of iceberg lettuce, shredded to within an inch of its life, a handful of frozen prawns that had been defrosted in a colander under the tap, and the Marie Rose sauce. It was pink, it was creamy, and we thought it was the height of gastronomy. It was the Bernie Inn experience brought into the home. To wash it down, we didn't drink dry Pinot Grigio or Merlot. We drank Liebfrau Milch. Brands like Blue Nun and Black Tower dominated the table. They were sweet, white German wines that tasted vaguely of syrup and gave you a headache before you'd even finished the glass. If you were really splashing out, you bought Asti Spumante, a sparkling wine so sugary it was basically alcoholic lemonade. We drank it out of Paris goblets, those smoked glass tumblers that every household seemed to own. But the true icon of 1980s culinary luxury appeared at dessert. It wasn't the Christmas pudding, which was seen as a bit old-fashioned by the modern 80s housewife. It was the Viennetta. The Viennetta was marketed not as an ice cream, but as a lifestyle choice. The television adverts showed it being sliced by elegant people in evening wear, the chocolate layers cracking with a sound that was pure ASMR before the term existed. To put a Viennetta on the table was to say, "We have made it." It was a ripple of vanilla waves and dark chocolate shards that looked like a piece of edible architecture. We fought over the ends because that was where the chocolate was thickest. And let us not forget the roles of the newest appliance in the kitchen, the microwave. By the mid-80s, the microwave had landed. It was the size of a breeze block and cost a week's wages. We were obsessed with it. We didn't just use it to reheat leftovers. We tried to cook the entire Christmas dinner in it. There were actual cookbooks dedicated to the microwave Christmas. We microwaved the sprouts. We microwaved the gravy. Some brave souls even tried to microwave the turkey, resulting in a pale, rubbery bird that looked like a forensic experiment. We didn't care that it tasted worse. It was fast. It was modern. Finally, as the Queen's speech finished and the washing up was ignored, the ritual of the after-eight mints began. This was the height of 80s etiquette. The long, dark green box would be passed around the lounge. You took a mint, a thin wafer of chocolate filled with peppermint fondant, and crucially, you were left with a little paper envelope. The pile of empty black envelopes on the coffee table grew like a dark snowdrift as the evening wore on. It was a minty conclusion to a meal that was defined not by its nutritional value, but by its desperate desire to be posh. While we were eating our Viennetta and playing Manic Miner, a sinister shift was occurring in the toy industry. The 1980s marked the end of innocent toy buying and the birth of the toy riot. Before this decade, supply and demand usually balanced out. If a kid wanted a train set, you bought a train set. But in 1983, a doll arrived from America that changed the rules of engagement forever. The Cabbage Patch Kid. This wasn't just a doll, it was a mania. They were adopted, not bought. They came with birth certificates, and crucially, there weren't enough of them. For the first time, the British parent faced the terrified reality of the sold-out sign. The desperation was palpable. We saw scenes on the 9 o'clock news that looked like civil unrest. Grown adults fighting in the aisles of Hamleys, tearing boxes out of each other's hands, shoving, screaming. A Cabbage Patch Kid became a status symbol. If you had one, your parents were either incredibly lucky or incredibly violent. Then, in 1984, came the Transformers. Robots in disguise. It was a marketing masterstroke. It was two toys in one, a car that turned into a robot. But again, the scarcity was artificial and cruel. Every boy in Britain wanted Optimus Prime, but Optimus Prime was rarer than gold dust. Most of us ended up with Ratchet, the ambulance, or Jazz, and we had to pretend we were happy about it. This was the moment Christmas became competitive. It was the era of the must-have. The playground became a brutal hierarchy based on who had the AT-AT Walker and who only had the Stormtrooper. The manufacturers knew exactly what they were doing. They were creating FOMO, fear of missing out. Before the acronym existed, they weren't just selling plastic, they were selling social acceptance. This aggressive commercialism reached its peak with the cartoons. He-Man and the Masters of the Universe was essentially a 22-minute advert designed to sell Castle Grayskull. We watched the show, we saw the toy, we demanded the toy. The loop was closed. The 1980s child was the most sophisticated consumer the world had ever seen, and our parents were the exhausted financiers of our obsession. But while the toys were causing riots, another rectangular plastic box was quietly revolutionizing the way we consumed the holiday itself. The VCR. If the Cabbage Patch Kid defined the chaos of the high street, the VHS recorder defined the revolution in the living room. Until the early 80s, Christmas TV was a tyranny of the schedule. The Radio Times was law. If The Great Escape was on at 3 p.m., you watched it at 3 p.m. If you were eating dinner, tough luck. If Grandma wanted to watch The Other Side, you missed it. The nation was synchronized by the broadcast signal, but then the black box arrived under the TV. It was heavy. It had a clock that blinked 12s because nobody knew how to set it, and it changed everything. The VCR, video cassette recorder, introduced the concept of time shifting. Suddenly, we were the masters of time. "Don't worry, I'll tape it," became the catchphrase of the decade. We could record Top of the Pops while watching the Queen's speech. We could tape the James Bond film and watch it 3 times in a row. This was magical, but it also marked the beginning of the fracture. We were no longer bound by the collective experience. We could curate our own viewing. It also introduced the ritual of the Christmas video rental. On Christmas Eve, the local video shop, a place that smelled of damp carpet and stale popcorn, was raided. We didn't just rely on the BBC anymore. We rented movies. We rented Ghostbusters. We rented Gremlins. We rented Beverly Hills Cop. We brought Hollywood into our homes on our own terms. The video rental shop was a treasure trove of neon-sleeved possibilities. Standing in front of the new releases wall, arguing over whether to get a horror or a comedy, was a key part of the festive build-up. And the physical act of clunking that tape into the machine, the whir of the motor, the tracking lines on the screen that you had to fix with a little dial, was a visceral part of the 80s experience, but this freedom came at a cost. The communal national moment, the 28 million people watching Morecambe and Wise in 1977, began to dilute. We were still watching TV, but we weren't all watching the same TV at the same time anymore. The VCR was the first crack in the dam of the shared British culture, a crack that would eventually shatter completely with the arrival of the internet. But amidst the neon glow of the fairy lights and the laughter of the studio audience on the VHS tape, a darker reality was lurking. The 1980s Christmas was spectacular, but it was built on a foundation that was shifting beneath our feet. For decades, the British working class had operated on a simple economic principle. If you didn't have the money, you didn't buy the thing. You saved up. You joined the Christmas club. You put money in a jam jar. The hamper was the symbol of this prudence, paid for, pound by pound, throughout the year. The 1980s destroyed this model and replaced it with something far more seductive and dangerous: the credit card. This was the era of the flexible friend, the marketing for access, with its catchy jingle, "Does you does, or does you don't take access?" And Barclay Card was aggressive and everywhere. Suddenly, the wallet wasn't limited by the cash inside it. It was limited only by a credit limit that seemed to magically increase. For the first time, parents could buy the Commodore 64, the pile of He-Man figures, and the crates of Liebfrau milk without actually having the money. The Never Never ceased to be a shameful last resort and became a standard way of life. This fueled the consumer boom. It explains why the 80s Christmas felt so lavish compared to the 70s. We were borrowing from the future to fund the present. The perfect Christmas was no longer something you earned. It was something you charged. But this created a new, specifically 80s phenomenon: the January hangover. We all remember the feeling, the decorations coming down on 12th night, leaving the room looking bare and gray. The return to school or work, and then the thud on the doormat. The statement. The anxiety shifted. In the 1970s, the anxiety was, will the shop have the turkey? In the 1980s, the anxiety was, how are we going to pay for it? The joy of the unboxing was replaced by the low-level dread of the minimum payment. The Christmas club had been a safety net. The credit card was a trap. We had traded the security of the hamper for the thrill of the plastic, and the British Christmas has never really recovered its financial innocence since. If the credit card changed how we bought Christmas, the new wave of personal technology changed how we lived it. And the biggest casualty of the late 1980s was the conversation. In the 1970s, you couldn't escape your family. If the TV was on, you were all watching it. If the radio was on, you were all listening to it. There was no escape from the arguments, the bad jokes, or the snoring of your grandfather. You were trapped in a collective sensory bubble. But in the 1980s, we invented the mute button for reality. The Sony Walkman. It appeared on the heads of teenagers like a sudden alien growth. Those flimsy metal bands with the bright orange foam pads. You put them on, you pressed play, and suddenly, the room disappeared. You weren't in a semi-detached house in Wolverhampton listening to your auntie complain about her hip. You were in a music video. The phrase, "take those things off your ears," became the new mantra of the British parent. The Walkman allowed us to curate our own soundtrack. We retreated into the privacy of the mixtape, isolating ourselves from the communal noise of the holiday. It was the first step towards the headphone zombies we have all become today, and it wasn't just audio. The visual fracture began in the 80s too. This was the decade of bedroom culture. As home computers became cheaper and portable TVs, often black and white sets with a loop aerial, became affordable, the children left the lounge. The Commodore 64 moved from the family rug to the bedroom desk. The teenage sanctuary was born. On Christmas evening in 1989, you might walk into a house and find the living room half empty. The parents were watching Only Fools and Horses downstairs, but the son was upstairs playing Elite in the dark, and the daughter was in her room listening to Brothers. The hearth, the single glowing fire that the tribe gathered around, had been extinguished and replaced by multiple solitary screens. Then, right at the death of the decade, came the final nail in the coffin of social interaction, the Nintendo Game Boy. It arrived in the UK just as the 80s turned into the 90s, officially 1990 but imported by the lucky ones before. It was a grey brick. It had a screen the color of pea soup. It devoured batteries, but it was hypnotic. It took the isolation of the computer and made it mobile. You could sit on the sofa, surrounded by family, but be entirely mentally absent, stacking blocks in Tetris or stomping Goombas in Super Mario Land. The one-screen household was dead. The 1980s had started with everyone staring at the Radio Times, arguing over which one channel to watch. It ended with us, plugging ourselves into our own private devices, physically together but digitally apart. The noise of the family Christmas, the singing, the bickering, the chatter, was slowly being replaced by the tinny hiss of headphones and the electronic bleep of a high score. Looking back through the static of time, the 1980s Christmas appears as a strange, neon-lit bridge between two worlds. It stands with one foot in the analog traditions of our parents, the paper chains, the sherry, the coal fires, and the other foot firmly planted in the digital future of the silicon chip. It is easy to be cynical about the decade. It was, undeniably, a time of rampant materialism. It was the era that taught us to value the price tag over the sentiment, where the size of the pile of presents became a competitive sport, and where credit card debt began to erode the prudence of the past. It was loud, it was brash, and it was often incredibly techy. But God, was it exciting! There was a raw, kinetic energy to an 80s Christmas that we have lost in our streamlined, Amazon-delivered present. The sheer physical effort of it. The crowds at Woolworths, the weight of the Argos Catalogue, the 20-minute wait for a game to load, gave the holiday a texture that modern convenience has smoothed away. We were the last generation to experience the world before it was fully connected. When we sat down to watch Top of the Pops, we knew the whole country was watching with us. When we played on our computers, we were explorers in a new digital frontier, not just consumers of content. We were the pioneers of the pixel. Today, our Christmases are perfect. The trees are tasteful, the food is gourmet, and the gifts arrive the next day. But something of that manic plastic joy has faded. We have traded the screech of the ZX Spectrum for the silence of the smartphone. So, spare a thought for the ghost of Christmas 1985. Picture the living room, the foil decorations spinning in the heat of the gas fire, the smell of ozone and roast turkey, and a child sitting cross-legged on the floor, bathed in the blue glow of a portable TV, holding a joystick with white-knuckled intensity, absolutely convinced that they are living in the greatest time in history. And looking back, perhaps they were.